and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about the 2004 movie called Hotel Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda was directed by Terry George, and it tells the story of a hotel manager named Paul Rusesabagina who shelters over 1,000 refugees at his hotel called the Militia during the Rwandan genocide. And since we'll be covering the genocide in this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the atrocities that happened, so listener discretion is advised. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie is Heycke, the author of Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire, Multiculturalism in the World's Past and America's Future. Before we connect with Jens, it's time to set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. People who were at the hotel said afterward that Paul Rusesabagina was not a hero. Number 2. The only lives saved during the Rwandan genocide happened at the Militia. Number 3. 1 out of 4 adult male Hutus participated in the genocide. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Heycke about the historical accuracy of Hotel Rwanda. Let's start, as we often do on this podcast, by taking a step back and looking at the movie from an overall perspective. What letter grade would you give Hotel Rwanda for historical accuracy?
I would give it a C-. I'd say first off, it's a wonderful movie. The first time I watched it, it was engaging, it was moving. From a cinematic perspective, I thought it was a really wonderful movie. Most critics agree that it does a good job of showing the Rwandan genocide and like bringing that to the minds of people around the world. And it was a really valuable movie from that perspective. The problem is when you go beyond that, the story itself, and if you look at the movie marquee, the movie poster, it doesn't say based on a true story like your podcast. It doesn't say inspired by a true story. It says a true story. And it is manifestly not a true story. Even if we go by Paul Rusesabagina's own written account of what went on in the Hotel Rwanda, there are many, many discrepancies. But over the years, there have been a number of journalists who have interviewed people at the Hotel Rwanda, starting with someone named Ndahiro in 2008. He interviewed 70-some people in the Hotel Rwanda, and every one of them said Paul Rusesabagina was no hero.
Oh.
Odette, who is the young woman doctor portrayed in the movie, has said that, yes, he helped save her and her family, but once again, she said that the man is no hero. 2016, a guy by the name of Edward Kayihara, who was in the Hotel Rwanda, wrote a book that laid out the whole story, and he interviewed many other fellow survivors. And once again, they all said the same thing. Paul Rusesabagina was no hero, quite the opposite. He did some fairly nefarious things. And just to flesh that out, we can say that these people have been influenced by the current Rwandan government, which is an authoritarian government to a large degree, that they've kind of been pressured by that government to portray Rusesabagina, who was recently arrested and convicted by that government, that, they've been pressured to portray him in a bad light. But even if we go beyond those people and look at the UN people, a neutral third party, they're saying the same thing. So, for example, Romeo Dallaire, who was the head commander of the UN in Rwanda at the time, in a webcast I participated in, he called that movie pure Hollywood crap.
Wow.
Those were literally the words he used. I wrote them down at the time because of that. And, just to give you another quote, another UN official who was there, a guy by the name of Amadou Deem, he was Captain Amadou Deem. He said, "I was not able to watch the movie beyond a point because I found it so repulsive for its untruthfulness."
Wow.
So
wow.
Not only are we getting these stories from Rwandan survivors of the hotel who may or may not be under pressure from the government, we're hearing this from the UN people, that the movie was completely inaccurate. And we can talk about some of those inaccuracies as we go along.
Well, we'll start to get into some of those because the movie starts in Kigali, Rwanda in the year 1994. And before we see anything on the screen, we hear radio broadcast from RTLM, Hutu Power Radio, as it's called. And to summarize the message of the broadcast, it says the Tutsi were collaborators for the Belgian colonists and they stole our Hutu land. Now they're back and we will wipe out the RPF rebels. And if we jump ahead to the movie a little bit, there is some more explanation when we see Joaquin Phoenix's character, Jack Daglish. He's chatting with a local journalist there named Benedict. And to paraphrase what Benedict tells Jack in the movie, he says the Belgians created the Hutu and Tutsi division by picking people based on their looks, those with thinner noses or lighter skin. He also says the Belgians used the Tutsis to run the country. Then after the Belgians left, they left power to the Hutus, and then the Hutus took revenge on the Tutsis with years of repression. How accurate is the movie's explanation of how the division between Hutus and Tutsis came to exist?
So, on that part, it's actually fairly accurate. Before the colonialists came, and actually the Germans were the first colonialists, the Belgians took over just after World War I. But before they came, there were different groups there. Hutus and Tutsis. It may go back centuries which group arrived there first, but by the time the colonialists arrived, the distinction was kind of a nebulous one. Generally speaking, the Tutsis were cattle herders, and the Hutus were farmers. There were some physiological differences, or some differences in appearance. But because there was a lot of intermarriage between the two groups, and a Hutu could become a Tutsi and a Tutsi could become a Hutu, those differences were not, they weren't enough to really go by. And in fact, during the genocide, there were a lot of Hutus who were killed because they were mistaken for Tutsis, and Tutsis who escaped because they had fake identity cards and so on. What the Belgians did is they came in and they ossified this distinction which previously had been somewhat nebulous by issuing these identity cards. And there's some debate as to how exactly they did it. Early on, supposedly they took a census and based it on the number of cattle each person had. If you had 10 head of cattle, you were a Tutsi. If you didn't, you were a Hutu.
Okay.
And at the same time, later on, at some point, they did seem to hone in on physiological differences. If you go to the Genocide Museum in Kigali, they have this photograph of them measuring the width of somebody's nose with a caliper. So that may have played a role. But when you think about it, the fact that they needed to issue these identity cards says that there wasn't an obvious difference that you could pick out. If there was a clear racial difference between the two groups, you wouldn't need an identity card, would you?
Yeah, it's a good point.
The previous hundreds of years, there was so much back and forth between the two groups that distinction had really faded. And just to add to it, there's actually another group in Rwanda that you rarely hear mentioned, the Batwa, who are essentially pygmies. That's the American word I think that's used. They're less than 1% of the population. And there's at least one group of Twa who are clearly physiologically distinct who became Tutsis. So that distinction, it was really quite nebulous until the Belgians came in and issued those identity cards. And then what they did is they demoted a lot of Hutu chiefs and put Tutsis in positions of power, basically. So largely that description was true.
Okay. And then when the Belgians left, who did they leave in power when they left? Was that?
Well, the Hutus were the majority. What was interesting is for the first 30 years or so of Belgian colonial rule, they distinctly favored the Tutsis over the Hutus. It reversed in the last few years of Belgian rule. They actually flipped it on its head and they started demoting the Tutsi chiefs because they thought the Tutsis were acting too arrogant and were kind of agitating for independence. So they wanted to take the Tutsis down a notch. So this whole system of preferences that had actually already been flipped on its head by the time the Belgians left and the Hutus took over.
In the movie, you mentioned his name already, but we get to meet Don Cheadle's character, the main character, Paul Rusesabagina, and he's the house manager at a hotel in Kigali called the Militia. It's owned by a Belgian company called Sabena, and that'll come into play later on in the movie's timeline. But one night we see Paul and his wife Tatiana witness a neighbor across the street being beaten and taken away by soldiers. And then later Paul mentions to his wife Tatiana that he's been currying favor with powerful people at work, so he can call in those favors if something ever does happen to his family. And then an important note for the story is that Paul is Hutu while Tatiana is Tutsi. How does the movie do setting up who Paul and Tatiana Rusesabagina were?
So this is where it starts to go downhill from the very beginning. We know from Rusesabagina's own book that he was not manager of the Militia, the so-called Hotel Rwanda. He was manager of the Diplomat, Hotel Diplomat, which is about a 10-minute walk away. So he was never originally the manager of the Militia. What happened is the Hotel Diplomat, which he did manage, was closed down. And more than a week after the genocide started, he basically went to the Hotel Militia and declared himself in charge. What had happened is there was a European manager who fled as soon as the genocide started, and he turned over the keys to a guy at the front desk and said, "You're in charge. Here are the keys. Don't let anybody else have these keys." And this will be important as we get more into the discussion. But Rusesabagina was not manager of Militia. So all this footage of him driving around in this Militia van at the beginning, that's nonsense. He wasn't manager of that hotel at the time.
Okay, I think it does mention Hotel Diplomat. I think there was a line I remember from the movie. I don't remember the specifics of it, but he mentioned something about how he used to work at Hotel Diplomat now, and then so the impression I got was now he's working at Militia. And yeah, I think that there was also even a brief mention where it shows his boss leaving, but he gives the keys directly to Paul, and he's like, "You're in charge now. I have to go to this other hotel." Basically.
Yeah, that's absolutely not what happened. The keys were given to a guy by the name of Pasa, who was then in charge of the hotel. Paul Rusesabagina shows up a week later and says, "I'm in charge here."
Okay, we're starting to get some of the inaccuracies here for sure. That's a pretty big one too. Just from the way the movie sets everything up.
Yeah. No, I'll grant you some of the other stuff in that was correct. Tatiana's wife was a Tutsi, and absolutely no doubt that people across the street from them and all around were being murdered. I mean, 1 out of 7 people in that country was murdered during the genocide. So you would absolutely see that all around you.
What about the impression of Paul wanting to garner favor? That was something that I kind of gathered from his dialogue there with Tatiana was, I'm part of the reason for this job is like working with tourists, working with people coming in, or, I'm garnering favor with people who can help if we ever need it.
Yeah, so the hotel he did manage, the Hotel Diplomat, was really the nerve center for the Hutu power movement and a lot of the big figures in that movement. So there's no question he rubbed shoulders with them and had drinks with them. Whether or not he was doing that to curry favor to protect people or if they were just his friends is a separate question.
There is a scene in the movie where we see a news report of the head of the armed forces, General Bizimungu, and he denies the rumors that the army is training the Hutu militia called the Interahamwe. As I was watching that, the first thing that I thought was he has to be lying, because why else would this be included in the movie if he was telling the truth? But of course, in the real world, things are not always as obvious as in movies. So can you fill in the gaps of what we don't see in the movie about who the Interahamwe was?
So the Interahamwe started off as a youth section of the ruling political party, the MRND. They sort of morphed into, over time, into paramilitary organization. We know from the International War Crimes Tribunal that happened after the genocide that both the Rwandan military, the FAR, and the French government not only armed but trained Interahamwe members, which is, it's really quite incredible. We can talk more about the French involvement in all of this as we go along. But so there's no question that, Bizimungu was lying there. Because both the Rwandan military and the French military helped train and arm the Interahamwe.
And also tried to cover it up then, too?
Yes, absolutely. And, an interesting side note add here is we're shown in the movie the number 2 guy in the Interahamwe. They don't mention Robert Kajuga, who was the actual president of the Interahamwe. And just to underscore how arbitrary this Hutu-Tutsi difference was, Robert Kajuga was actually had a Tutsi mother and really a Tutsi father. The only reason he was regarded as a Hutu is by chance his father got a Hutu identity card early on. So the head of the Interahamwe was like 2/3 Tutsi. It's really quite incredible.
There's another group that gets mentioned, and they're simply referred to as the Tutsi rebels. So the way I interpreted it was in the movie was there's the official Rwandan military, then there's the Hutu militia, and then there's this Tutsi militia, these what they call the rebels. And the impression I got was they branded the rebels because the actual military tends to be on the side of the Hutu militia. Is that a correct interpretation of the way the movie shows things?
Yeah, there's no question that the FAR, the Rwandan military, and the Interahamwe, they often acted hand in glove. There were some situations where there were Tutsis who were actually effectively resisting, and the Rwandan military would go in and wipe them out, or start attacking with heavy weapons, and then the Interahamwe would come in afterwards. Or in other cases, the Hutu military or the Rwandan military would actually direct the Interahamwe to go in and attack Tutsis in certain places. I did want to add, it's interesting in the movie that for some reason they only referred to Tutsi rebels, and I sometimes was wondering if there wasn't a political motivation for that, because the group that we're talking about is the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And they're not just a random group of rebels at all. The core of the RPF, all its leadership, were descendants or people who had fled Rwanda in 20, 30, 40 years earlier. And most of them were based in Uganda. And most of them were part of the Ugandan military. So they were highly trained and well armed. A lot of these people literally ripped off their Ugandan military insignia and then went and joined the RPF and participated. Paul Kagame, who was the head of the RPF later on, he was high ranking in the Ugandan military. So these weren't just random rebels, at least at the core. They were actually a sophisticated army that was well organized and well trained.
Oh yeah, that's not the impression I got at all. I mean, because it mentions them being rebels. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's no question that they picked up supporters along the way, but
Sure.
the core, the leadership of the RPF, these were sophisticated soldiers, which is, they're outnumbered like 7-1. So they have to be really good at what they're doing.
According to the movie, there are two things that kind of spark the start of the genocide itself. The first is when the Rwandan president signs a peace treaty with the Tutsi rebels, and then shortly after that, he's assassinated. And we don't really see much of that in the movie, but we hear it through news reports and people telling Paul about it. Can you fill in some more historical details around that event?
Months before the genocide took place, there were what were called the Arusha Accords, which was a power-sharing agreement between the Hutu-led government and the RPF. And that led to a lot of agitation within the Hutu-led government's ranks. A lot of people considered Habyarimana, who was the president at the time, a traitor for signing those. And in particular, there's a group called the Akuza, centered around actually Habyarimana's wife and her family, who were really ardent hardliners. And they were very upset that any power would be ceded at all to the Tutsis. They didn't want that. So that there was that unrest simmering within the Hutu ranks long before the genocide. And it's absolutely the case that when Habyarimana's plane was shot down, that triggered the genocide, and that's what really started things off. But there was a lot simmering beneath the surface, before that, and it's still disputed who actually shot down the plane. The Rwandan government to this day claims that it was hardliners within the MRND that were responsible for it. But there's still, the French government for a while was claiming that the RPF shot it down.
Well, I mentioned there were two things that sparked the genocide, and that being the first one. And then the second thing that the movie puts forward is kind of similar to what you were talking about, where there was things that were already simmering. That talked about the radio broadcast at the very beginning of the movie. And then this time there's another radio broadcast that blames the Tutsis for the president's assassination. And the man on the radio gives the code word saying it's time to cut the trees. And that's the code word to start the genocide, basically.
Yeah, that was the actual trigger. They issued that. It was code word, cut down the tall trees, and that's when the violence really started off. And the influence of RTLM radio cannot be overstated. It was enormously popular because it was a fun radio station. They had lots of like really informal broadcasting. Instead of the normal state radio, there was kind of really staid and boring. RTLM was kind of dynamic, and they played popular Zairian music, and even a lot of Tutsis listened to it because it was good radio. It wasn't all the hate stuff you hear. There was other content, and so lots of people tuned in, and it was hugely influential. Now, a few studies have been done over the years about RTLM radio, showing where the coverage areas were, and a few of them correlated the RTLM coverage with where the most killings happened, and did statistical studies and found that it was hugely influential. So much so that the UN actually asked the US to try to jam the signal, and it's actually a very sad story that the United States chose not to do it, partly because, amazingly, they didn't want to violate Rwandan airspace and Rwandan communication protocols, and also it would cost $8,500 for each plane flight. So they didn't want to spend that money, even though at least one of these studies showed that if they had blocked RTLM radio, possibly hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved, at least tens of thousands.
Wow. I mean, that's a testament to the power of how just the power of words. I mean, and that to motivate people in this case, towards terrible actions and hatred.
Yeah, in this case, it was not only the inspiration, the hatred that it was spurring for Hutus to kill Tutsis, it was literally offering practical advice, saying, "Oh, we know there are a bunch of Tutsis hanging out in this place. You guys go and get them." So it went beyond, simple spurring people to hatred. It was literally orchestrating part of the genocide.
So what, I mean, you mentioned the code word, cut down the tall trees. If they're literally having these calls to action, like go get these people, why have a code word?
They did a lot of that there, and there was a need, or they felt a need to hide what they were doing, at least from foreign eyes. So there were actually some differences in the Kinyarwanda broadcasts done by RTLM and what they did in French. They were far more explicit in Kinyarwanda, but they were always using code words. So in Tirahamwe, for example, basically means a bunch of people getting together to work together. And that was another euphemism they used for killing people. They called it work. It's like, okay, guys, let's go to work. There were some bits of the RTLM broadcast where they said, be sure you don't see the Westerners, the foreigners, observe, don't let them observe you doing your work, i.e. killing people. And make sure you don't smile if they see you when you're doing your work. So they felt a need to at least hide it a little bit from Western eyes, and that's why there were a lot of code words used.
I guess that kind of goes back to the general of the army hiding that they were helping to train the militia and that aspects too, like this fear of the Western powers almost.
Yes, and there was a constant need or they felt a need to keep relations good with the West, in particularly with France, which had been a big supporter there for a long time. So the mere appearance of basically a white-skinned person could deter a lot. Interestingly, there's a guy who just lives up the road from me by the name of Carl Wilkins. He's the only American to stay in Rwanda throughout the genocide. And he went, there was an orphanage near where he was, where the kids in this orphanage were almost certainly going to be killed. And he went there as it was being surrounded by the Interahamwe and basically camped out in there. He slept overnight in this orphanage and single-handedly, just by appearing there, he deterred them from killing all these orphans.
Wow. I mean, yeah. Wow. What a story. I mean, I would like to see a movie about him.
Carl Wilkins. Yeah. I would too. It's to me, it's one of the great tragedies of this movie is there were some incredible heroes in the Rwandan genocide, and it doesn't celebrate any of them. This guy, Carl Wilkins, there was Philippe Gaillard, the head of the Red Cross, risked his life many, many times. Captain Diagne, who is a Senegalese, ultimately he saved hundreds of people and brought Tutsis to safety. And you never hear his name. He was actually killed at one of the checkpoints. He's in Senegal, he's a hero, but outside of Senegal, nobody's ever heard of this guy.
We were talking about the Western powers, and back in the movie, we do see a UN presence in Rwanda. It's highlighted just before the violence starts as Nick Nolte's character, the UN's Colonel Oliver, leads a press conference to celebrate the peace treaty that we talked about earlier, signed by the president. And then we talked about the president being assassinated and subsequently the massacres starting. In the movie, as this is happening, Colonel Oliver says his orders are not to intervene because they're, quote, peacekeepers and not, quote, peacemakers. What was the UN's reaction as violence started to break out in Rwanda?
The UN really failed in this instance. The individuals on the ground, people like Again, Oliver is a fictional character. The actual person was Romeo Dallaire. What they did was absolutely heroic. This guy from Senegal, who I had just mentioned, was one of those. These guys repeatedly risked their lives to save people, and they really didn't get any credit in the movie for that, which is sad. In fact, interesting side note here: Dallaire, who is a pretty big figure, this Colonel Oliver in the movie, they never interviewed him once when they made that movie. They never talked to the guy.
Wow.
One of the major figures in the story, they never spoke with him. And I think partly because he would have disagreed with the movie.
He was told what really happened.
Yeah. So in terms of how the UN reacted, Dallaire, before the genocide, he had somebody high up in the Interahamwe who came to him and basically told him what was going on. He said, their weapons caches, they're compiling a list of Tutsis in Kigali, basically an assassination list. They have a plan to kill Belgian peacekeepers, which turned out to actually happen. They killed 10 Belgian peacekeepers. And Dallaire, in a famous fax, it's called the genocide fax, he faxed this to Kofi Annan, who was head of peacekeeping at the UN at the time. And they brushed him off. They said, "Oh, you're not to get involved." Dallaire was sending all these warnings up, and nobody was listening to him at the UN headquarters. So the UN really failed on this one.
Wow. I think I remember a brief mention where Colonel Oliver in the movie does mention that they killed 10 of his men or something like that. So it sounds like that part at least happened, but in the movie there seems to be no reaction to that they killed 10 soldiers and nothing seems to come of it.
Yeah, that, for all we can tell, based on Dallaire's intelligence, that was pre-planned. And these 10 Belgian peacekeepers were actually, they were guarding this woman who was the successor to Habyarimana, who was assassinated. So she was assassinated. These Belgian peacekeepers were tortured horribly and then killed.
At one point in the movie, we see the cameraman, Joaquin Phoenix's character, Jack Daglish. He goes outside the hotel grounds to shoot some footage, and then he comes back with something showing people literally being cut down by machetes in the streets. His boss, David, makes a call saying that he has footage of a massacre, needs to be on the evening news. And there's another point in the movie where we hear some news reports on the radio. Someone keeps using the term genocide-like events. And then there's a journalist in the report that actually asks how many genocide-like events are needed before it's simply called a genocide. Did the world learn about the genocide as it was happening, like the movie seems to imply?
They really didn't. There were a few early reports, but what happened is the journalists and all the foreigners, as we saw in the movie, fairly early on, they all got removed from the country. So a week into the genocide, the New York Times was making these reports that things were kind of getting better. Why did they seem to be getting better? Is because there were no reporters there to report on what was going on. So, things were coming out, but the press was portraying it mostly as a civil war and not as an actual genocide until much, much later on. And that part they really missed, that it was a true genocide. As far as the UN and the US goes, there was a reason for them to avoid using that term. And it's basically the 1948 Genocide Convention, which says it compels signatories to that convention to act if there's a genocide in progress. So nobody wanted to admit that it was a genocide because then they would be compelled to do something.
Wow. Compelled to do their job, basically.
Yeah. And so neither the UN nor, for a while, the US wanted that, because it's like, keep in mind that the Somali fiasco, Black Hawk Down, had just happened a few months before this. So both the UN and the US were kind of shell-shocked in terms of getting involved in, what looked like difficult internal, squabbles within African countries because it had ended very badly for a bunch of Bangladeshis and a bunch of Americans in Somalia.
Do you think that played a big factor in them deciding to basically out of sight, out of mind almost, it sounds like we're just going to ignore any reports coming in and because we don't want to get involved?
Yeah, you definitely see in discussions within the Clinton administration that they were reluctant to act because they felt like after the Somalia incident that there would be no public support for it. And they were probably right. The UN finally, first after cutting the number of troops in the country from 2,700 or to about 300, they were going to build back up the force. Dallaire wanted to build it up to 5,000. But the UN asked around, and they couldn't find any countries who were willing to contribute troops to that effort. Nobody wanted to get involved.
Well, you mentioned the 300, and I was actually going to ask that because we do see that in the movie. You mentioned, everybody kind of leaving as well, and we see the orders to evacuate as the movie puts it, the foreign nationals. There's some French troops that roll in. At first, everybody thinks they're safe in the hotel, but then they realize they're just there to get the foreign nationals, which the movie makes the point of saying basically all the white people are leaving. And meanwhile, more people are showing up to the hotel. So that means there's even more refugees at the hotel. All the foreign nationals are being evacuated, and that just leaves Paul to figure out what to do with them. And you mentioned the 300, Colonel Oliver in the movie, he mentions that he's been given 300 UN soldiers for the entire country. So the most he can spare for the hotel is 4 soldiers. Oh, and by the way, they're also not allowed to shoot anybody. So basically, they're just there for their presence, whatever good that's going to do. It sounds like a lot of that, the details may not be accurate, but it sounds like the basic gist there is true.
Yeah, that they were not allowed to shoot was correct. The number that were there was understated. It was actually a contingent of 8 to 10 guys. They also had an APC and armored personnel carrier there at the hotel. So the movie kind of plays down what they actually had. And the other thing is they were in constant radio contact with the UN, the UNAMIR headquarters. So if anything did go down, they could alert them instantly. And that was kind of the defense mechanism, is that they were an early warning. So the fact that there were only a handful of guys there isn't necessarily meaningful, because they really were backed by the whole UNAMIR force.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like from what you were saying earlier, with the guy that that went to the orphanage, even just their presence could be enough to help stop a lot.
Yes, that was the case with the Red Cross workers too. For example, it didn't always work. The Red Cross guy ran into some really tight situations a few times, but there was certainly within the Rwandan military, there was a desire to keep up a good appearance in the face of the Europeans.
I have to ask you about a sequence of events in the movie. Well, actually, as I was watching this, I actually talked to the TV and I was like, Paul, you're a genius for this approach. It started when Paul was talking to everyone at the hotel, saying that they have to call everyone that they know to say goodbye and basically shame them into sending some help. He also insists that they keep up the look of it being a 4-star hotel. So he keeps issuing bills to people for staying there. He mentions, what to do if they can't pay the bill. So doesn't seem like he's really charging, but he's establishing a paper trail, though, in case somebody wants to look for that. And it doesn't stop there, because right after that, there's a scene with General Bizimungu, who comes to visit the hotel. And Paul mentioned something about how he overheard the soldiers talking about the Americans continuing to watch the hotel with satellites. And then he compliments the general on keeping his men in line, points to one of his staff, Gregoire, who he can't even get to work. That was a bigger issue, because Gregoire seemed to be threatening to let someone know about the Tutsis at the hotel to keep from having to do any work. And so the general helps with that. Did the movie do a good job showing some of these clever tactics that Paul used to keep everyone in the hotel safe?
Boy, here again is where the movie really goes wrong. I think there are a lot of cases where people collectively in the hotel did something, and Rusesabagina turns that from a we into an I. um, there were a lot of really influential people with diplomatic connections and NGO connections who definitely used those by telephoning all over the world. Whether or not they did it at Rusesabagina's behest is quite another question. I'm pretty sure from all the accounts I read, they did it on their own, and he wasn't really such an influence there. Now, the story of Gregoire is where we really go amiss. Now, this Gregoire, as best I can tell, is this character I referred to before, that real life person named Pasa, who was actually supposed to be in charge of the hotel after the European manager left. And it's clear that Rusesabagina holds a grudge against this guy because of the way he's portrayed in the movie. Even in Rusesabagina's account, he did not occupy the presidential suite. He occupied the manager's residence, which he was entitled to do because he had been appointed interim manager. And part of the friction was that when Rusesabagina arrived at the hotel and said, "I'm in charge," and again, this is April 12th, so the genocide started on the 6th. So 6 days after the genocide starts, Rusesabagina shows up and says, "I'm in charge here." And Pasa says, "No, you're not." And it was only then that Rusesabagina communicated with Belgium and got them to send this fax that put him effectively in charge. And at that point, Pasa did hand the keys over to him. But I feel like in the way that he was portrayed in this movie was kind of a little revenge played by Rusesabagina against him, because it clearly does not correspond to facts. And we have testimony from other people in the hotel who said that Pasa shared his room with many, many other people, and that he was very helpful in the hotel. He was not this crazed Hutu militant as he's portrayed to be in the movie.
Yeah, he definitely does seem like somebody who will turn on them at a moment's notice, and he's just using the situation. It even goes down to mentions of him taking all the beer and things like that, where he just seems to be enjoying life.
I see that probably as payback. Now, when it comes to the bills that he's distributing, that's another really interesting point here, because we have, first of all, we have a fax. So there's actually a paper trail on some of this stuff. It's not just a he said, they said thing, because we have testimony that they said is a lot of people, and a lot of people testified that Rusesabagina said, "Pay up or I'm kicking you out of the hotel." And we have a fax from Sabena to Rusesabagina that says, "Don't charge people for food or staying in the hotel." On the other hand, we have multiple faxes from people in the hotel complaining to the Red Cross, saying Rusesabagina is charging us and he's threatening to throw us out if we don't pay.
Yeah, that's a very different picture than the movie paints. I mean, the impression I got from the movie, as I mentioned, is he's charging the bills, but like, if you can't pay it, that's fine. We just want this paper trail, and so it still looks like a hotel.
So we have one account, for example, that tells us that if you could pay a bit, he would let you stay in the hall, and if you could pay even less, you were put down by the pool. But to stay in your room, you had to pay full board. And this is based on a lot of interviews. Once again, maybe the Rwandan government is pressuring people to testify this way, but these are interviews we've had over the years. Journalist Joshua Hammer from the New York Times, who did a story in 2021 where he interviewed people from the hotel, and we just see these things getting confirmed over and over. It's really troubling.
You mentioned the facts, and that comes in the movie, it comes from Sabena, which is the company that owns the hotel. And I wanted to ask about that because there is a moment in the movie where we see Paul calling up the president of Sabena, a guy named Mr. Tillins in the movie. And he's obviously horrified by what's going on. And we find out later that Tillins called the French president that got the militia to leave the hotel alone for a little while longer. So basically, Sabena helped pull some strings to help protect the people in the hotel. Did they really do that?
You know, that's hard to say. We do know that the French had enormous pull with the Rwandan military. Once again, the French had played a big role in supplying them over the years. So they wanted to keep those relations good. So that's altogether possible. On the other hand, we also have a lot of accounts of pressure that Romeo Dallaire and the UN was exerting on the Rwandan military to keep the hotel safe. The movie portrays it as a single-handed effort by Rusesabagina to save this hotel. The reality is there were a lot of other factors involved, including the fact that there were important people in the Hutu government who had relatives who were staying in the hotel. So this guy, Robert Kajuga, that I mentioned before, his brother was in the hotel. So there were a lot of incentives for both the Interahamwe and the Rwandan military to save that hotel beyond pressure from the French government. There was UN pressure. There was the fact that it was a meeting place for both sides. The fact that there were relatives of some influential people living there. So a lot of other factors really came into play.
Wow. Yeah, that's very different than the impression I got in the movie, where it seems like they're just waiting to get into the hotel I think they used the term traitors, in the people in the hotel. That's a very different impression than I got watching the movie. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Near the end of the movie, there is a flurry of activity that happens. Paul's suggestion of having people at the hotel ask anyone they know for help seems to work. Colonel Oliver shows up and at the hotel, he lets them know that there have been some exit visas issued by countries for some of the people at the hotel. Not everybody, but some of the people. So they go in a caravan of UN trucks to be taken to safety. Included in that are Paul and Tatiana's family. But at the last minute, Paul decides he can't leave everyone still at the hotel, so he stays behind. The UN caravan ends up being ambushed, probably because Gregoire alerted the militia. We see him driving off. They only survive because Paul calls in a favor with General Bizimungu, whose troops clear out the Interahamwe militia. So the trucks don't ever reach their destination, but at least they're able to get back to the hotel safely. How much of that actually happened?
So that actually did happen. There was a convoy that went out, and they were attacked. People in that convoy were beaten, including small children. It was really a terrible scene. This again was a situation where a couple of the UN people they showed themselves to be real heroes. In one case, I'm actually looking for this guy's name because I don't remember it off the top of my head. It was another Senegalese guy. He basically said, if you're going to kill any of these people, you're going to have to kill me first. So there was some really heroic behavior by the UN folks on the ground there. What really stopped it was that there were negotiations going on between the RPF and the Rwandan military at that point, the FAR. And there was actually a threat by the RPF that if you kill the people in that caravan, we're going to take these negotiators that you've sent us as hostages and maybe kill them too. So there was a lot more going on behind the scenes, and there was also pressure from the UN to let them go. So now going to the point of Gregoire releasing the list, this is a he said, they said situation. That's Rusesabagina's account. According to Stefan Stech, a Polish, I believe he was a captain with the UN, he believed that it was Rusesabagina who released that list and not anybody else in the hotel. So very different portrayal. And again, it's kind of a he said, they said situation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the impression I got, we talked earlier about Rusesabagina kind of gaining favor in that aspect, and that was kind of the impression I got. Was now towards the end of the movie, he's starting to call some of those favors in and starting to take advantage of some of that. But it sounds like not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I don't have any doubt that he did call in favors at certain points. I mean, he certainly did to save his own family, and also to save Odette and her family. They were personal friends of his. There's no question that he used some of that influence in those cases.
That makes sense. I mean, I think there was a brief mention of that in the movie where he focuses more on his own family. So, I mean, that's what mattered the most to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. As the movie does come to an end, we see another UN caravan. Paul knows they can't stay at the hotel. So this time it's everybody that's leaving. And they drive by countless people fleeing the violence. And then they see the Interahamwe in the road ahead. Colonel Oliver tells the driver not to stop. And then soldiers show up on the side of the road with machine guns and open fire on the Interahamwe on the road. Since most of them have machetes, there's not much return fire. And instead, we see the Interahamwe running away. Paul explains that they made it past the front lines of the Tutsi rebel force that's pushing them back. Is that really how they finally made it to safety?
Yeah, it more or less is. In fact, there was a caravan of multiple vehicles because they actually couldn't even fit them all in one trip. It was essentially a hostage exchange. What they arranged was that the RPF was also releasing some people at the same time. And interestingly enough, most of the vehicles in the caravan did go to RPF territory, but some of them actually, by choice, some of the individuals in the hotel chose to go to Gitarama, which was still being controlled at the time by the Hutu-led government. Although most of them went to the RPF territory and were then safe.
That makes more sense based on what you were saying before, where it wasn't, I don't remember the guy's name, but his brother being in the hotel.
Yeah, basically. Robert Kaduga, for example, and I believe his brother did go to not to the RPF controlled territory. He went the other way.
At the very end of the movie, there's some text that explains what happened to everyone. It says Paul sheltered 1,268 Tutsi and Hutu refugees at the hotel. Tatiana, his brother and wife, were never found, so they adopted their 2 children. General Bizimungu was captured and put on trial for war crimes, and the Interahamwe leader, mentioned him briefly earlier, George Rutagunda, was sentenced to life in prison at the same trial. How accurate is the movie's explanation of the way the story ended?
So it is correct that those various people were captured and they went to the International War Crimes Tribunal and were sentenced. Several of them have since died in prison. Several are still there. I think from all that I've read and people that I've talked to, the bit about Paul single-handedly saving 1,200 people is, stretching the truth a bit.
Yeah.
And again, we have to look at this all in the context of there are a lot of people contradicting what Rusesabagina says. Many of them may or may not feel pressure from the current Rwandan government, but we have the neutral testimony of UN people that also contradicts what Rusesabagina says, that it was really the UN that helped save those people more than Rusesabagina.
Well, speaking of Rusesabagina, this obviously is not in the movie at all, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention in 2021, the real Paul Rusesabagina was given a 25-year prison sentence for some terrorism-related charges. I'm sure that can be an entire episode by itself. But can you give an overview of that situation, kind of what happened to him?
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on it. There have been terrorist attacks against Rwanda over the years, including just my book talks about one that happened just a few years after the genocide, where people came in from Zaire, former Interahamwe people, and killed. They basically killed virtually all the girls in the school. Young girls. They shot them, and there's been a steady stream of those over the years, to the point that when I was last in Kigali, every building you go into there, even shopping malls, have metal detectors when you walk in to detect hand grenades or whatever. There were two prominent attacks, 2018 and 2019, which is what really motivated the Rwandan government to go after Paul Kagame. I'm sorry, not Paul, Paul Rusesabagina, because he was associated with the group that carried out these attacks. And he says, I was only associated with a political wing, not the violent wing. Yet you can look it up. There's a YouTube video which that group tried to take down, where he endorsed the military wing and said that it's time to go beyond just words. We have to act. So that's really what they were going after him for. Now, on the flip side, a number of human rights organizations have criticized, first of all, the way he was basically abducted. He was more or less kidnapped to be brought to trial. So that was a problem. And there have been criticisms also of the way the trial was conducted. So, that's where we are with that. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, it sounds complicated. And it kind of, at the end of the movie, when it talks about, the genocide officially ending, it says that the Tutsi rebels drove the Hutu army and the militia across the border into Congo. And the impression I got from that was, it's a movie and it kind of wraps everything up, but it sounds like everything is not all, a happy ending necessarily. It sounds like there's definitely still some conflicts going on.
In fact, what happened after the RPF came into Kigali and took over, 1 million Hutus fled over the border into Zaire at the time, what's now Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it became a massive humanitarian crisis because you had 1 million people flood into the area around Goma. And amazingly enough, the rest of the world had ignored the genocide up until that point. But this made it on CNN, and all of a sudden the UN and the United States were flooding in with all kinds of aid, basically to aid a lot of people who were genocidaires, who were involved in the genocide, which is really incredible. So to this day, there's an Interahamwe and former Rwandan military presence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and they do, over the years they've staged all kinds of little incursions over into Rwanda. So that's an ongoing problem. I'm
just guessing the aid from UN and things end up being a lot more expensive than if they had just stepped in to save lives to begin with.
Oh yeah, and the real tragedy of that situation where all these Hutus had fled into Zaire is that the aid that was going to them was getting commandeered by former Interahamwe people who were acting kind of like mafia bosses and really controlling the situation. So it was really tragic. It made things worse in a way. And if only they had given Romeo Dallaire the troops that he needed to stop the genocide early on, if they had acted earlier, so many lives could have been saved and so much trouble could have been averted. It's, one of the great tragedies of the 20th century.
Since the story in the movie, as we've learned throughout, is very heavily slanted towards Paul Rusesabagina's account, who were some of the real people that didn't get mentioned in the movie?
So I mentioned already Carl Wilkins, who's, again, one of the few Americans who remained in Rwanda throughout the genocide, who, pretty much single-handedly saved an orphanage of 500 kids. And he actually went to the acting prime minister at the time, Kambanda, and asked him to give protection to those orphans, which he did. So Carl did an amazing job. Philippe Gaillard from the Red Cross went drove in and out of danger constantly with his life under threat and saved, hundreds, if not thousands of people. Captain Mbeya Diagne from Senegal, he's a UN guy. He brought hundreds of people, not only to the Hotel Rwanda, or to the Mille Collines Hotel, but also to other UN safe sites. And he was killed by a mortar shell, I believe, at one of the checkpoints. So he was, an amazing hero. Romeo Dallaire, who I also mentioned previously, who's head of the UN contingent there, risked his life repeatedly, saved many, many people. Another figure was Bernard Kouchner, who was one of the founders of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And he went on his own without any authorization by the French government and basically made Bizimungo assure the safety of the people in the hotel. So that wasn't Paul Rusesabagina who did that. This is Bernard Kouchner, who was really the hero in that instance. And the last person that kind of comes to mind is an Italian nun who served at the Neomata Church. And she was unfortunately killed actually before the genocide. Her name was Locatelli. And then, in addition to that, there were many, many Hutus on the ground who helped save their neighbors. It is the case that 1 out of 4 adult male Hutus participated in the genocide, which is,
Wow.
A staggering number.
Wow.
On the other hand, 3 out of 4 didn't participate. And some of those people saved their neighbors. They saved strangers. So, all of those people, I think, deserve some recognition for their incredible heroism.
Yeah, it sounds like this movie would be a great one for a remake and
Yes.
redo it a little bit better.
I would love to see some stories done about some of those people because it's just so striking how many of those people just what they did to risk their lives to save others.
Thank you so much for coming on to compare history with Hotel Rwanda. Obviously, the movie is from Paul's experience, or as he says, his experience was throughout the genocide. But before I let you go, I wanted to transition to something you talk about in your book called Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire. I'd highly recommend it to anyone listening. There's a link in the show notes to get your own copy. And this is a quote from the book that really stood out to me. Quote, "The high-speed but low-tech slaughter required hands-on participation by many thousands of individuals, often killing people they knew, neighbors, soccer teammates, and former drinking buddies." That's end quote. It's an eye-opening sentence, and it really showcases how hatred can make people turn on their own friends. It's not like it's complete strangers. And it made me think of the part where in the movie where Paul mentioned something about how he was currying favor, made him think that he'd have friends to call on when he needed help, but at least according to the movie, it didn't really help. So perhaps this is the most difficult question of all. I think it's important to learn from our past. What's the key thing that you think the average person should learn from this part of history?
I think, racism is the gift that keeps giving. And I mean gift in the worst way, kind of like the German sense of the word. It's poison. And unfortunately, one generation of racism tends to lead to another. So, I'm using the term racism loosely in this case because there wasn't really a racial distinction per se, but it had all the marks of racism of the Tutsis and the Belgians against the Hutus, and then it got flipped on its head from the Hutus against the Tutsis. And I think if there's one lesson here that really stands out, and my book talks about this in other situations as well, and that's that the solution to racism is not more racism. And that's the road that Rwanda went down, that when they got independence, instead of saying, okay, let's move forward as one country, they instead said, now it's time for payback against the Tutsis. And we've seen that situation in a lot of other countries, places like former Yugoslavia and in Sri Lanka, where they, instead of saying we're going to be a united country going forward, they said it's time for payback. So that's always a dangerous road to go down.
I'll make sure to include a link to your book in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Heycke once again for sharing his knowledge about the true story behind Hotel Rwanda. And if you want to learn more about the true story, that's just one of the stories that Jens tells in his new book called Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire. Hop into the show notes right now to get your copy of his book. Or if you're driving or unable to do that right now, as always, you can find a link to it on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/264. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the two truths and one lie. Number one, people who were at the hotel said afterward that Paul Rusesabagina was not a hero. Number two, the only lives saved during the Rwandan genocide happened at the Mille Collines. Number three, 1 out of 4 adult male Hutus participated in the genocide. Did you catch which one is a lie? We'll start with number one. People who were at the hotel said afterward that Paul Rusesabagina was not a hero. That is true. As we learned from Jens, many of the people who were there for the real event were interviewed afterward, and they said Paul was not the hero he's made out to be in the film. That brings us to number two. The only lives saved during the Rwandan genocide happened at the Mille Collines, or Hotel Rwanda, as it's sometimes called. That's the lie. Jens told us stories of many other people who helped save lives during the genocide and weren't even mentioned in the movie. That means number three is also true. 1 out of 4 adult male Hutus participated in the genocide. Sadly, there were a lot of people who were involved in the Rwandan genocide that saw people murdering their neighbors and hundreds of thousands of people killed. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I really hope you've learned something new. If you got value out of today's episode, consider giving some value back. You can give back whatever you feel you got out of this episode over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value. Or you can give back some value simply by sharing this episode with a friend or family member who you think would enjoy it. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.